We want to know where you were that day, too. You're dating a man who did some egregious stuff.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most credible voice in true crime. Quite a lot has been happening in the Watts case, although a lot of it not necessarily from Watts himself. It's just kind of the behind the scenes stuff has sort of been happening. Detective Baumhover has been blogging. He's recently just posted his second blog about PTSD. And although he's not ostensibly trying to talk about the Watts case specifically, he is referring to certain elements in the case which hopefully we'll learn more about as he goes along. Some of his posts are quite long. They are often to deal with his religious views and the way that he's suffered trauma as a result of the Watts case. And of course the whole social media circus around this particular case is almost like no other. It's kind of unprecedented, and that kind of makes the pressure so much worse. The conspiracy is so much worse. The online chatter so much worse. So even though it's Friday and I'm going to be doing a little bit of socializing today, I haven't been covering the Watts case in much detail for the past couple of days and weeks. I've been focusing more on something most people wouldn't even associate with true crime, Vincent van Gogh. But I wanted to come back and just address three problems with the accessory theory. Like what Agent Tammy Lee said to Chris Watts after he failed his polygraph, we need to talk about what actually happened. And so if you're interested in that, please subscribe to this channel, like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So we're going to deal with three problems, and the first problem is why the Watts children weren't killed at the well site. Now, the conventional narrative, the narrative that almost everyone seems to believe, is the one that immediately followed the so-called second confession. And this was essentially covered in Dr. Phil's exclusive scoop prior to the release of the discovery, the audio, and the transcript of the audio from that well-known second confession. And you may remember what the Rzuceks lawyers said. The Rzuceks went on to Dr. Phil and sort of told the world about the second version. And how it kind of went was that Chris Watts had said that the children were alive at the well site. And Coda then asked, really, was Bella still in the back of the truck alive? And so now Watts had to kind of explain the interactions between himself and her. He had to say what she was doing. He had to say what she was saying. And he sort of had to kind of provide a scenario for what was going on. Now, what's quite interesting is he never really talks about anything that he said to Bella. There's sort of almost no interaction from his side. But then he does mention two things that Bella asks him. Bella says to him, what happened to Cece? This is supposedly in the back of the truck at the well site. And then Bella follows that up saying, is the exact same thing going to happen to me as Cece? And a lot of people listening to this version on Dr. Phil were horrified, shocked, traumatized by it, but they also took it at face value. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go to the transcript of the CBI report very briefly and just deal with this particular section. So it's page 10 and 11 of the CBI report. And now I'm going to read from the report. Bella and Celeste were sitting in the back of the truck as he removed Shanann. Bella and Celeste asked him, "What are you doing to Mommy?" He doesn't recall what he told them. So in this situation, they are at the well site, and Chris Watts has gone to the back of the truck and he's removed Shanann's body basically from, I guess, under their feet. And now they're saying, "What are you doing to Mommy?" So both children are sitting in the back, and they're in kind of an unfamiliar place. They've never been there before. And they're asking, "What are you doing?" And he says, well, he doesn't know what he said to them. Then it continues. He returned to the truck and Cece was first. So there's not really much description here. Did he go and did he dig a hole? Did he just remove Shanann from the truck? In any event, there's that section. I'm not going to deal with the remainder on page 10. You're welcome to read it on your own. But on page 11, he says, after Celeste died, he took Celeste out of the truck, walked her up to the oil tank, opened the hatch, and dropped her inside feet first. And that's not true. He didn't just drop her inside. He was asked about, was it a tight fit? And then he said he didn't hit Celeste, but he may have had to manipulate her. So even in that explanation, he kind of wasn't really being truthful. He sort of said he dropped her into the tank, and then later on he said, well, yeah, okay, I had to manipulate her through. Then he closed the hatch and returned to his truck. When he got to the truck, Bella asked him what happened to Cece. Now, this is where I would ask you guys, how many of you are mothers with children? Like, how many of you've got experience with children? Raise your hands. How many of you've had any kind of dealings with small little children? Raise your hands. Any mothers out there? So what I want you to try to imagine now is let's try and make this as simple as possible. Let's take Shanann out of the equation. Let's sort of let's just not deal with that part in this particular analysis. In other words, we're not going to talk about a scenario where the two little girls are sitting in the truck and Watts is taking her body out and moving it somewhere and burying her, and what the children are doing while he's doing this. Bear in mind, this would have had to have taken something like 20 minutes. So we're not going to talk about that. We're also not going to talk about what happened after that. The only part I want you to focus on here is where Bella is sitting in the truck and Watts takes her body out and walks to the oil tanks, walks up the steps and puts Cece into the oil tank. What I want you to do is try to imagine that you are Bella, or that you're sitting right beside Bella. You're sitting alone in the truck. There used to be 4 people in the truck. It used to be just a few minutes ago. You were in the truck with your father, your sister, and your mother, and now you're alone in the truck. Now no one's in the truck except you, and your father is carrying your sister up the sort of that metal catwalk. And you can apparently see this because you afterwards you say, well, is the same thing going to happen to me? So what you see, you're sitting in the truck, it does have windows, and you can see what is happening. And so you sit there and then you see this action take place where your father is carrying your sister away, right? And you've already seen what's happened to your mother, but anyway, let's leave that out of it. Now your father's returning to the truck and you're just sitting there. And when your father returns to the truck, and this person is Chris Watts, what happens? Does he open the door, and then does Bella say, "What happened to Cece?" Does she say that? She doesn't scream it. She's not crying. It's just very sort of matter of fact. What happened to Cece? And then Bella will say, "Oh, is the same thing going to happen to me as Cece?" And also spoken, just kind of matter of fact. So I guess what I'm trying to ask you is, do you think in human behavior, do you think a child would see something like that and then just be completely unemotional, just sort of sit there and be sort of inert? Now, there are a couple of ways you can answer the question. The one way is you can go to some of the archive of videos that remain of the watched children, and you can look at how they behave. You can look at how they respond to certain situations. There's one interesting video where they're playing in the rain, and they've sort of already run out into the rain, and then Shanann takes out a phone and wants them to run back out into the rain. But then they say, and kind of both of them say they're cold, and they don't really want to do it anymore. Well, I think it was more Bella than Cece. What's also interesting is when Bella's at the beach, she's sort of less interested in sort of swimming in the sea than Cece. So she's kind of a little bit scared, of going into the sea. So you can refer to some of those videos. There's also the Christmas video, and then just ask yourself, if Bella's aware of this stuff happening, do you think she's going to just sort of sit there and do nothing? And also, do you think if you go into the mind of Chris Watts, do you think it would be kind of safe to leave the one child in the truck while you are walking away somewhere else? I mean, wouldn't there be the chance that the child would get out and run around the well site, or kind of run after him or something like that, either run away from him or run after him, just as she supposedly did in the driveway, that she's going to sort of just do whatever she wants to do? Isn't there kind of a risk of that? So that's the first problem with the accessory theory, which kind of includes this whole idea of the children being alive, right? Being alive on the driveway. Now we're going to deal with the accessory theory in sort of more on the chin, which is specifically dealing with Nicole Kessinger. Now, at the beginning of this episode, I provided a very short clip from Kevin Kobach's interrogation with Kessinger on August 16th. What I'm going to do now is provide that clip in context.
The reason I asked, and I'm not really concerned about your location. I think we already have your cell phone records. At some point, did Mark ask you to supply? Did they ask for consent to get cell phone records? That'll probably be done by warrant. If we wanted,
that what you just did?
Nope. What I'm talking about is your movement.
Oh.
By GPS or by cell phone tower to show where you were. Obviously, and I don't want to cause you concern, we want to know where you were that day too. You're dating a man who did some egregious stuff, and we want to show that you were never near him that day. Period.
I mean, you guys can track my stuff.
No, I mean that was something we will have to get a warrant for, anyways. I'm just saying, if we asked for it, would you have any objections to that?
No, you can have it.
So.
If I'm a pretty boring person, I don't. It sounds
like you just went to work that day, and then you came home, and you were there at 3:45.
Yeah, like give or take, like 5 minutes, but yeah, so 3:45.
So first of all, what we get from that little clip is Agent Kobach kind of saying, "I'm not very concerned." Bear in mind, he's whatever he's saying is being recorded, and he knows it's being recorded. So probably what he's saying is the same thing that law enforcement believe, unless he's trying to mislead Kessinger, which I don't believe is the case. I think he played the whole thing fairly open cards. Certainly, I think far more so than Coda and Lee did with Watts. I think it was just fairly sincere and straightforward with Kessinger. I don't think she was that straightforward back to him, but I do think Kobach, when he says, I'm not really concerned, I think that's true, don't you? The next thing the agent mentions is that he has Kessinger's cell phone records, and based on that, he seems to be satisfied with the situation. And he should be. He knows that she spoke to Chris Watts for 111 minutes on the phone. And there's some people who are speculating that while she was speaking to him on the phone, she was actually with him, like at the same time. Most people tend to have a long conversation with someone else because they're not going to see one another. Or in the case of Crystal Kenny, when she was literally an accessory with Patrick Frazee, there were multiple short calls. She was literally cleaning up the crime scene and he was giving her instructions. And there were multiple sort of short calls and texts over quite a long period. Another thing that is also very interesting with the Frazee case is the handsets move together at the same time. And not only the handsets of Patrick Frazee and Crystal Kenny, but also of the victim, Kelsey Bereth. None of that occurs in this particular case. And then we go to Kessinger's response to this. So she's told that he's not really concerned. She doesn't say anything. She's told that they've already looked at her cell phone records, and she's kind of under the impression, hasn't this already been sorted out? Like, haven't you guys already established where I was based on that? You know, she's not sort of hysterical. She's sort of more annoyed. It's like, haven't you gone down this road already? You know, haven't you figured this part out anyway? And so Kobach's got to emphasize, he's got to be absolutely clear. He says, you know, what I'm talking about here is your movement. We want to know exactly where you were. When this happened, where were you? And there's a little bit of uncertainty around when the crime happened. That is why when the district attorney initially announced it, he said, you know, the crime that happened between the 12th and the 13th. And he said that because they guessed that the children were killed on Sunday and Shanann was killed on Monday. That was what they guessed. When we observe Kessinger's response, so basically Kobach said to her, we want to know your movement. Kessinger sort of replies, oh, like, and you know, does that sound like she's being cagey? Does that sound like she's trying to make excuses or hide something? Or is she just sort of kind of almost naively surprised? Oh, is that what you want to do? And then Kobach kind of talks about, you know, we're going to use cell phone towers and we want to see where you were, right? And then he sort of hedges that by saying, you know, I don't want to cause you concern. Now, bear in mind at this point, Kessinger's cooperating. She's given them some of the information, obviously not everything. And that's why I've put an image there where in the video, this video, you know, that you're watching now, where Kobach says, you know, the reason I'm concerned is because you deleted information off your phone. But they were still able to get kind of what they needed. And what they needed was her location. And what they also needed was the call records, which they ultimately got. So they did find out, so some information that was deleted on her phone, you could still get from Verizon. And that's what they did get. And they did have these logs of calls. But what's interesting is Kobach is quite careful to say, you know, I don't want to alarm you. I don't want you to be anxious. But this is the situation. You have been dating someone accused of a very serious crime. And the reason he's saying that is saying, look, we do need to investigate you. Bear in mind, she's coming forward and she's providing them with information. but it's kind of a very delicate dance. She doesn't want to be prosecuted, right? And at the same time, they have got to say to her, well, look, you do need to cooperate with us. So it's kind of, there's a little bit of give and take. They're saying, this is what we need to do, but they also don't want to scare her where she's going to say, okay, I'm very worried here. I'm very worried that I'm going to get into trouble, so I'm going to hire a lawyer and I'm not going to cooperate. And that's exactly what Crystal Kenny did. Kenny felt like the cops got too close to her. She hired a lawyer. She ended up taking a plea deal. She's got a 3-year sentence for her role in the crime, and it's a very, very light sentence. In Kessinger's case, she didn't hire any lawyer, but she could have walked away at that point. She could have said, it's getting too hot for me in the kitchen. I'm not going to do this. And why would she? Why wouldn't she walk away? And why wouldn't she hire a lawyer if she was involved? And so the other side of it is, if she wasn't involved, then she didn't really have that much to worry about, although there was quite a lot to worry about, like losing her job. But the point is, Kobach was saying to her, look, we do need to investigate you, and we are investigating you, and we do need to clear you as a suspect. And this is the part that I find a little bit bizarre with some of these conspiracy theorists, is it's almost like they're saying, they're sort of knocking on the door of law enforcement and saying, guys, why don't you do your job? Why, do you know what to do here? You need to investigate Kessinger. She was. Here it is on the record where she's being told that she's being investigated. So do you really think what they found was that she was involved, and then the cops just said, oh, shrug, we're not going to do anything about it? I also heard one of the YouTubers saying how badly the crime scene was investigated. Where was the crime scene tape? All this kind of thing. I don't know whether this person knows true crime very well, but, in this particular case, Chris Watts succeeded in bamboozling people by making them think that this was a disappearance. It's not the only time this has happened. The same thing happened in the John Benet Ramsey case. So when a family member who knows the family best kind of says, oh, you know what happened? There was a kidnapping. Then you're not investigating it as a murder. You're investigating it as something else. And that gives the advantage to the person who's actually involved, the person who's actually covering up. In Chris Watts' case, by saying that Shanann said that she left, why would he lie? He could be telling the truth. And because they believed him, there was no crime scene tape. The same kind of occurred in the Casey Anthony case as well. It was initially reported as a vehicle theft, right? So even that case, that took a very long time for that case even to be classified as a murder or the death of somebody. And what you've got to bear in mind is the police can't just do that. And that's exactly what's happening in the Gannon Storch case right now. It doesn't look like the child's alive. It looks like there could be foul play, but the police can't just put crime scene tape and make accusations. They can get into trouble. They need reasonable cause. In the Madeleine McCann case, you had the same thing. There was this talk of an abduction, and so there was no crime scene tape. And if anything, that was the case that warranted it. And you should have had people coming in. But what they thought maybe she wandered off, and they thought that because of just the circumstances, that the parents had been somewhere else, and then the child apparently disappeared without the involvement of the parents. So what else could it be than the child just walking out of an apartment that wasn't locked in a place she wasn't familiar with? So there are many, many, many instances where there aren't sort of the proper protocols of crime scene tape kind of thing. Another aspect that is almost the same as when we talk about Bella sitting in the truck by herself, just having seen what's happened to her sister and just being completely normal, her affect just completely normal, just, a little child like that in very strange circumstances, just acting completely normal, not worried about anything. If you take that same thing and you say, so forget what we know or don't know about this case. Why would Nicole Kessinger, who's in a new relationship with this guy, want to murder someone? And then I would like to be in a relationship with this murderer. I'd like to start a new life with this murderer. Would you like to marry a murderer? Would you like to, if you've just met somebody and then you find out that they're a murderer, would you want to help them with something, or would you want to be involved with them any further? And then you add all the other stuff, and then you find out that they made someone pregnant, and would you still now want to be with them as well? Because if you turn that whole thing around, you've got to say, if they've committed a murder, what's going to stop them from murdering me? Or conversely, if I'm committing the murder with that person, what's going to stop that person from maybe wanting to take care of me when it suits them? All those sort of things. Plus your co-workers, plus, as I say, you barely know each other. And one of the things Kessinger said on the Sunday, this is documented, this is an actual text, she said, I'm still not sure about him. Now, you'd think if someone's going to be an accessory to murder, that's quite a commitment. That's like getting married. And you see that kind of commitment in Crystal Kenny's relationship with Patrick Frazee. They'd been on and off for years, not a couple of weeks. They'd been on and off for probably around about 10 years or more, right? Frazee had asked her to leave her husband, and then they would get together. That's literally what she did. She was married and she left her husband. When she got married, Frazee said, are you sure about this? I still care about you. So he was sort of haunting things from the start. She even had an abortion. She felt pregnant by him. And all of these things together formed a tapestry of connection for Crystal Kenny. And so because of this, because she was obsessed with him, and she thought, maybe she thought by doing this, she's going to prove her love to him. And maybe he said, prove you love me, or something like that. And then I will prove I love you, and I will marry you, and we will finally live together. None of that is sort of happening in this scenario with Kessinger. And in fact, again, if you look at the aftermath, not only the cell phone contact, but also you look at how quickly Kessinger just spoke to the cops several times and gave over her information without a lawyer. Kenny, it was totally different. It took her much, much longer. Initially, she didn't talk to the police. A month went by. Finally, the police tracked her down, and finally, she agreed to cooperate. And when she cooperated, it was to make sure that she didn't spend more time in jail than it was looking like she was going to. So if you want to understand a legitimate case where there is a mistress who's an accessory, it's the Patrick Frazee case. And I've written a book about that called Murder Most Foul. So go and check that out. Also happened in Colorado. And an interesting question in the Frazee case is the mother was actually killed in front of the little girl, not directly in front of her, she's probably in another room, but the mother was killed. And then you've also got to ask, why in that case, why was that not like the Watts case? Because there were also financial problems there. Why was the mother killed and not the child? And I think part of the answer is Kenny probably wouldn't have wanted to be involved at all if the child was killed as well. So that's the one part of it. And the other part is he stood to inherit more from his father if there was a child in the equation as well. if that makes sense. So his father had just died and the inheritance was being contested, and he stood to inherit more if there were children there. So, in other words, if he had a child. So this kind of is the opposite in the Watts case, where a child is being used in a way to gain additional money, whereas in the Watts case, it was, sorry to put it this way, but it was Watts, I think, trying to cut his losses. And this brings us to the third problem: why a shadow on the driveway does not equal a child or children. And this, of the three problems, this is both the biggest problem, but also the hardest to disprove. Now, what's interesting is when Tammy Lee spoke to Chris Watts about it, she said, how could they just disappear? And Chris Watts responded, they were there. And he sort of put his hands down on the desk, his hands sort of open, and he sort of put his hands down on the desk saying, they were there. And Tammy Lee sort of challenged him and said, they weren't there. They didn't leave. They vanished. And the only way they could have left is in your truck. Now, we know, and Watts knew then, that there was surveillance video of him loading up his truck, right? So one thing you could ask is, if he's saying they were there and he knew there was surveillance video and there was a question about, was it bodies loaded into his truck or not? One of the things he could have said is, I was loading my truck and one of my children was sort of running around the driveway. And, I said to Shanann, can you take care of the child? In other words, he could have used that as an alibi. So why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't you say, well, it's on video of me, running around. If this is the case, in other words, he knew that the children were alive. He knew there was video of showing the children alive. So why not use that as an alibi? Why not say they didn't leave with me in the truck because they were alive, and not only that, they were running around the driveway, so I didn't do anything to them. Why not use that? Why not say, when I left, the children were alive, or something like that? But the first confession is an animal of its own. He was being led down the garden path to implicate Shanann, which is what he did. So, that's just something separate to deal with. When we deal with the actual surveillance video, what we're dealing with is we're looking with the eyes of a motion detector camera. It's not just a normal camera. It is a motion detector camera. And if you've got experience with a camera like that, what it is showing you is fuzzy. It's not like a constant stream of video, if that makes sense. So that's the first point to emphasize. The next point to emphasize is the area of the shadow that everyone has gotten so excited about is literally like looking through a keyhole, right? So if you imagine your field of vision being, say, 100%, now you're looking through a keyhole which is like 1%, and now you're looking through that keyhole through another keyhole, which is the bottom of the truck. And you've really got to zoom out and look at the original field of vision of the camera to appreciate how tiny that little rectangle is that you're looking over the two vehicles that belong to Trinastich, between the trees, and that's kind of essentially the first keyhole, right? In other words, the distance to get to the object that you're looking at through the trees, that's the first keyhole. But then there's a second keyhole behind that, and that keyhole is that sort of misshapen triangle that is the small little area that is lit between the top of the truck, the driveway, which is lit, and then the bottom area, which is the top of the Trinastich vehicles, the sort of sloping metal and glass that you need to see over. So you're essentially seeing through two keyholes in order to see what you're trying to see. I've made a previous video where I just spoke about the point where when Chris Watts bends down and where the shadow is, he's way in front of that shadow when he bends down. So that's one point to raise. The other thing that I've mentioned this I think in a previous video, is that I was going to record some video showing how the whole shadow thing works, and I have done that. Although what I haven't done and what I haven't been able to recreate in the way that I would be happy with are the multiple light sources. So on the Watts driveway, there were around about 4 or 5 light sources. So there were the garage lights, 3 of them. Then there was the porch light, which was pretty powerful as well. So that's a 4th light. And then there was the light from the Trinastich residence, basically shining from the same direction as the camera. Now, just a couple of things to note with the camera. When you see what's coming alongside the truck on the far side, you actually don't see him. There's you see the shadow underneath him. And I'm talking about when he moves forward and when he moves backwards. There's it's almost as if the camera is not seeing him, then realizes, okay, that is not leaves, that's something. Then it sees something, and then it doesn't see something again. So in other words, there's an aspect to motion in the dark that it doesn't really recognize. So it almost records and doesn't record, if that makes sense. And digital is funny in that way when you record scenes at night, for example. So a good example is you can put a camera on, digital camera, and take a photo at night of street lights or something, and swing your camera around, and you'll get all sorts of lines of light or circles of light. I did that when I did photography work for the square kilometer array, where I had my camera on very long sort of aperture, and I wanted to get lines of starlight. But one of the things that I did, just kind of having fun with it, was I stepped in front of the camera and I wrote the word SKA for square kilometer array using a torch, just repeating the movements S with a torch, KA, and afterwards you actually had written in light SKA. I'm just saying that is one of the ways that digital cameras are weird. What they see isn't necessarily reality. And so with a motion detector camera at night through 2 keyholes, you're going to get something of like a delayed look. And also bear in mind, through that very narrow, I don't want to call it an aperture, but through those narrow keyholes, you've got a section where shadow is going to be blocked from your view because of the truck at the top and also the area at the bottom. And that changes things somewhat from what we're talking about. When we do study the shadow that seems to be advancing from left to right, it is a pretty compelling thing that we're looking at. But is it evidence? And the first issue that I told you about in terms of Bella doesn't really make sense. So even if you say it is evidence or it's good enough for me, then how do you explain what happened after that? Or don't you? Do you just say, well, this is good enough for me, even though the rest doesn't make sense? This is good enough for me, even in the context of a premeditated murder, even though the rest doesn't make sense. So I've actually run through all 3 of these problems actually quite lightly. I'm going to be dealing with all 3 separately in separate videos on Patreon if you're interested. So you can head on to Patreon/TCRS for a much more in-depth analysis of all 3 of these points, in particular the last one. Thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do. You may have noticed that every 4th episode I publish an update to Christopher Watts, What Else Do We Know? The next one will be episode 17. And we're now dealing with the very, very interesting aspect of the timeline, which is November 6th and the period afterwards where you kind of had the situation where Chris Watts's parents were now quite surprised by the plea deal, and they were kind of kicking against it. And so while he was happy to play ball and just, roll over and throw the towel on his own story, his parents weren't. And at this point, his parents believed that his first confession was true, that Shanann was involved, because obviously it was in their interest to think that their son was innocent or less guilty than he actually was. Before I sign off, I just want to address something that I've been accused of. Somebody said that because I believe the children were killed earlier in the day or earlier in the night, so in other words Sunday, that means I'm trying to suggest that Shanann did it because I've got something against Shanann, or I'm trying to do something like that. I'm not trying to implicate Shanann. I don't think Shanann had anything to do with this crime, and I never said that. I never said that Shanann, I never for a moment suspected that. The only area that was something that was interesting certainly was the blood alcohol levels. And that is something I checked out myself. I even had an expert check that out, and it turned out to be perfectly normal, just as the district attorney said. So if somebody is implying that I'm trying to imply that Shanann could have been involved, I'm not. I'm trying to say, and I've said it so many times, that there's only one person who's responsible for this crime, Chris Watts. Thank you for listening.
He's so disgusting. I'm so ashamed of him and everything, and I just... Oh, those little girls. They're so little. They're so little.
We talked a little bit earlier about getting some help for these things, and we can provide that.
Okay.
At really no cost. Don't want to put you through any more trauma than you've already been through.
Why? Ow! I don't even understand how you could bring yourself to do that to somebody who's that big.